Welcome back to Earth Station Trek, a show where we trek from the early days on NBC to the future on Paramount Plus and everywhere in between. I'm Charles Kelso, and it's my privilege to introduce the Earth Station Trek crew. Keith Johnson.
Coming at you at the speed of light.
Alan Seiler.
Lieutenant, get Starfleet on the horn.
Veronica Dashel.
Hi.
And Vandy Beth Glenn.
Hailing frequencies are open.
Welcome back to the show, Vandy Beth. It's been a while since we had you on.
It has been a while. Yeah. I hope you've missed me.
Absolutely.
Always.
Of course.
All right, Alan, did we have some news this week?
Well, you know what? This has been kind of a slow news week, as they say. So the one thing that I've got, just in case anyone watching has not seen this yet, the first episode of Lower Decks Season 4 is currently available for anybody in the world to watch on YouTube. So if you haven't seen it, if you don't have Paramount Plus, whatever the case may be, you can head over to YouTube and you can see the first episode of Season 4, and that will entice you to subscribe to Paramount Plus to watch the rest of that season before Season 5 starts, which is coming up very soon.
I think it's even better than that. I think the entirety of Season 4 is on YouTube. I think
well, if that's the case, then watch all of it. I thought it was just the first episode. Usually they only do the first episode.
I know.
Okay, well, cool. Everybody go watch Lower Decks Season 4.
Yeah, it's such a great show.
You will love it. And if you don't, well...
Keith, do we have some This Week in Trek this week?
You're dead to us if you don't love it.
Would never say that.
Yeah, there are a couple of things I found in Star Trek. These are all kind of seminal and iconic shows. I just thought they warranted a reference. So let's jump real quick. 29th of September, 1966. And I always think of these things in context of the time because you're talking in the 60s. And think about this coming on like 8 o'clock at night. But the final script was the 1966 was the debut of the episode The Naked Time.
All right.
Which is one of the best of the original series. Was copied.
Your favorite to say.
Is it though?
Yeah, there they go. They're always trying to make fun of that the one part of my Texas accent that comes out. But it's an interesting episode because I was just listening to someone discussing different stuff recently, and they said the thing you never do is try to give character sketches and revelations early in a show. And here this episode comes in incredibly early in the show and tells you who those characters are. And boy, does it work.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely amazing.
They did kind of the same thing, too. I mean, you know, doing it sort of establishes a pattern because they did the Naked Now early in Next Gen, like just a few episodes in. They did Persona Dramatis or whatever it's called in DS9 very early on.
Oh, yeah.
So it's that episode that shows you who these characters are by showing you for one episode who they aren't.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I think it worked. And I think it really boils down to sometimes I think there's no real rule what you should and shouldn't do as long as you have good writers and good actors. Because I've seen that done and it doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in this case, it worked. Then popping forward 5 years, this is a good one because it's significant. 1973, I was there. Saturday morning was the airing of an episode from the animated series called The Lorelei Signal.
Okay.
And I'm sure we're all familiar with what's significant about that episode, right? Of course.
No.
Uhura takes command.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
All the women get to rolling.
Right.
Nichelle Nichols always said that was her favorite episode.
Surprising.
Right.
Oh, it was a great episode. It also is an episode that helped start those memes of, because to spoil it for those who haven't seen it, but long story short, Kirk and company are aged because the women of the planet literally suck the life force out of men. And at the end, they put them through the transporter.
Boy, ain't that the truth.
Yeah, they're normally young again. So there you go. There goes that transporter.
Yeah, the magical transporter that can do whatever you like.
Yeah, that's amazing. And this is actually the last thing I got, and I'm combining this on October the 3rd, 1966. I found this incredibly fascinating. I didn't know this was the first draft of the Menagerie, parts 1 and parts 2. Well,
Okay.
here's the thing. When I say the Menagerie and I say 1966, you may say, well, what are you talking about? I didn't realize this. The first draft of that first pilot was called The Cage.
Mm-hmm.
When it was undergoing production, however, they changed the name to the Menagerie.
Yep.
I didn't know this. Charles, you knew this. And
Yep.
then they changed it back to The Cage, which is how it was actually released. And then later on, when they cobbled together the actual episode from the pieces of that, they went back to the name The Menagerie. I didn't know that one.
Yeah. Well, I think that because the Menagerie, the episode that we know as the Menagerie, kept that title when it came out. So when it was later when they released the original pilot, and so they went back to the original title. Which now it's hard to I wouldn't ever think of The Cage as the Menagerie. You know what I mean?
Right. And again, going back, you have to take your mind back to the 60s. Think about in the 60s, a science fiction show on prime time that used a name like the Menagerie instead of The Cage. I mean, I hate to say that that's really kind of sounding kind of long-haired and intellectual to use a term like the Menagerie. A couple of things I found real quick when I was researching on The Cage, which I didn't know this. I think everybody knows that there's always a rumor that Gene Roddenberry called it Wagon Train to the Stars, but everybody around him, kind of like everybody around Stan Lee, they dispute that he was the one who said that. However, Herb Solow, and this was confirmed, Gene Roddenberry wrote his first ideas for Star Trek on March 11th, 1964. By May, he had a meeting with NBC. The NBC execs said, we don't think we like this. This doesn't make any sense. Roddenberry, though a really big, towering man, was not a very aggressive guy. He was getting up to leave. And that might have been the end of Star Trek for all time. But Herbert Solow, who was there with him, basically said, look, we've done all this work and give us a show. And instead of 60 minutes, we want a 90-minute pilot, because if it's 90 minutes and it fails, you can still get your money back. And I'm not going to leave here until you give me a deal. And Gene Roddenberry sat there stunned, and they were like, okay, well, we'll try it. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And the other thing, again, Chuck, you might know this, I didn't realize this, is that they had 4 ideas in addition to Where No Man Is, in addition to The Cage, that they submitted. The executives at NBC didn't want this thing to succeed. So they chose the episode that they thought was going to be the most difficult, the most expensive, and the least likely to succeed, which is why they initially went with The Cage, even though they rejected it, because it called for location shooting and the crazy special effects for the Telosians. And then one of the executives from Desilu, as everybody knows, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's company, tried to argue against NBC to do The Cage because they thought it was going to flop because it was going to be too expensive, and they lost. And so they ended up doing The Cage. Then NBC turns around and said it's too cerebral, but they said, we'll give you another chance. And then, of course, to use the term, the rest is absolutely history. I think it's fascinating after all these years, and I did the research to realize how many times Star Trek literally came close to never being created, period, in the story. Yeah. Amazing.
And a lot like TV shows and movies, like it's amazing that any of them get made when you hear the stories behind them, because so many don't,
Yes. And the last thing I want to say is when they hired DeForest Kelley, he went to Gene Roddenberry, and I remember Harrison Ford said to George Lucas, George, you can write this SHIT, but you can't expect anybody to say it. When he was talking about Star Wars. But DeForest Kelley went to Gene Roddenberry, and he said, I don't know what the hell's going on with the show, and it's either going to be the biggest hit ever or it's going to be the biggest bomb ever, but I'll give it a try.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great. That's This Week in Star Trek History.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And now, Vandy Beth Glenn, welcome back to the show. We're glad to have you back. And now you pitched an interesting topic to us that we wanted to have you on and talk
Debatable.
About. We'll find out. We're going to put it to the test tonight. So you want to tell everybody what the topic is?
The topic, and I honestly am still kind of stunned that you bought off on this, is subspace radio, which is ubiquitous technology in Star Trek. Every every movie, every TV series has had subspace radio,
Right.
and they all use it. They never explain exactly what it is, so it's the most used and possibly the least explained of all their futuristic technology.
Right.
And I think it's interesting because it implies so many things that they're just never mentioned or talked about. I mean, the term subspace suggests that those signals are traveling through a different universe, or at least a different level of our universe, which sort of implies the existence of alternate dimensions or alternate realities, even before we get to mirror mirror. And it's apparently the first time that anyone in Starfleet has encountered such a thing. So I find that interesting, and it also enables other things that we know must be going on, but yet are never really talked about. Like subspace radio, we can assume is a counterpart or an analog to regular radio, which is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. It makes me wonder if there's subspace analogs to every other part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Are there subspace gamma rays? Are there subspace X-rays? Is there subspace visible light? Whatever that would mean.
Yeah.
But
that would mean there could be subspace Hulks and subspace X-Men.
Sure, Alan. Sure. But they talk about using their sensors, and they're rarely specific about what they're sensing with. But I would think that it would be if not part of this subspace spectrum, then something very similar to it, because they're always detecting things in real time that are many light minutes or even light years away.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you're right about the sensors thing, because it's something we sort of just take for granted in Star Trek. And the same thing with subspace radio is, I mean, the show couldn't function the way it exists without it, you know? Like it was sort of the conceit of the original series that they were like a, Captain Hornblower type situation where they're out on the frontier far enough away where they can't readily call base and find out what to do. Like it's up to the captain and the crew to solve the adventure, and then maybe at the end they'll get a message back saying, yeah, what you did was right, or what you did was wrong. But that sort of has changed with time, where now it seems like as long as Star Trek's gone on, it's gotten easier and easier just to talk to someone anywhere on subspace, unless there's some plot reason that they don't want them to be able to do it.
Right.
Charles, I to what you just said, I miss those days of the original series. I think the best example of what you were talking about with the subspace is Balance of Terror with the Romulans. And the whole point of that whole episode was the subspace message to the nearest starbase was going to take hours or days to get there and get back. And Kirk had to make this decision. Do I attack the Romulans or do I let them go? And what I love at that episode, at the end, after the young man who's supposed to get married, Tomlinson, is dead. Uhura comes to Kirk and says, we just got a response back in Starfleet. They said they'll support whatever move you make. And he has this really ironic look on his face. And then in another one, going back with the Romulans, the Enterprise incident, when the Romulans, when they're trying to steal the cloaking device, and Kirk babbles to the Romulan sub-commander, we've informed Starfleet. And the guy says something like, the subspace message will take 3 weeks to reach the nearest starbase. You only have a couple of hours to make your decision. I loved it like that. But even by the time Enterprise came out, Enterprise almost had instantaneous communication. The original, the first one, they almost had instantaneous communications with Earth throughout that time. So it did. I think they didn't like to do that anymore.
Right. In fairness, though, Enterprise never really went that far from Earth.
Yeah.
Not like all the other shows until season 3, when they went into the Expanse and they didn't have instantaneous communication with Starfleet. So
they flew to the Klingon Empire, or the Klingon homeworld in the first episode. It took them 4 days to get there. So
we can never figure that out.
Pretty fast as starships go.
Right.
Well, to be fair to Enterprise, a phrase I've never uttered in my entire life.
Wow.
I think they did say that it took like 6 weeks or even a few months to get from Earth to Kronos.
No, it was 4 days. I promise.
Yeah, it
Oh,
was.
okay.
It was in
Yeah,
dialogue.
it was ridiculously cool.
All right.
That's,
Well,
that's plot. But you know what that is? That's one of those things that people will piss you off on the internet when you do a Facebook discussion about Star Trek, and somebody will come in and go, "It's just a show. Quit analyzing it so deeply."
Yeah.
That's they had to do it for the plot to move.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Enterprise also had the conceit that they were dropping subspace relays around as they traveled. That were supposed
Right.
to,
Yeah.
I mean, presumably boost the subspace signal,
Mhm.
either increase the range or increase the speed. I don't remember for sure what the subspace relays did, whether it was a distance thing or whether it was a speed of communication thing. But
Yeah.
So from my limited understanding, and this is 100% coming from Tennessee Taylor Bobaverse.
it's not even Star Trek.
The what?
What? Look, they talk about dropping subspace things
Okay.
The what?
throughout as they're traveling. The Tennessee Taylor Bobaverse series.
It's a series of books.
It's a book series.
But
It's
go ahead.
amazing. But anyways,
Okay.
it's basically like you're dropping a Wi-Fi thing.
Yeah, sure. A
Somewhere,
tower.
and you're dropping a tower basically,
Yeah.
so you can stretch out the signal. Basically, what they're doing.
The cool
Yeah, but there's
thing
not an
about-
indication that like they couldn't get a message to Earth, just
Right.
they couldn't get it to Earth and back in time to communicate. So it seemed on Enterprise to me more like they were like increasing their speed of communication rather than their distance of communication, because they could communicate across planets. You know what I mean? Across star
Right.
systems.
Right.
Mhm.
The cool thing about subspace is it is a completely made up scientific concept for Star Trek, but it's not necessarily a completely made up concept, because if you think about our universe, Einstein showed we live in 4 dimensions, and there's a whole concept of if you could go down a lower dimensions like 2 dimensions, or even if you could access a fictional 1 dimension where the entire universe basically looks like a point to the entire universe. It's like a wormhole. You could go in one point and come out across the universe, and it's almost as if it was in 1 dimension, like everything is next to each other. So I always thought of subspace, what Vandy Beth said, is below our reality. And if it's below our reality, it could be a lower dimension, like a 2nd dimension and a 1st dimension. And I have read about subspace over the years. It is one of the most fascinating scientific gobbledygooks you will ever read, because they will explain it and they will babble about it. Evidently, there's a whole bunch of different subspace domains. Jordy mentioned that once in TNG. So there's levels of subspace where things go this fast. There's a level of subspace where later on they decided the transporters go through subspace, which was new. There's a level of subspace where like the Borg can do some of their traveling with those subspace conduits. Then there's races in Voyager that use deeper levels of subspace and things go even faster. It's kind of crazy. You can never find exactly how fast subspace travels. I've read, depending on the show, as many as 1,000 times faster than a starship to 30,000 times faster than a starship. I have no clue how fast it is.
Well, Spock in an episode of Strange New Worlds put a number to it. He said that subspace is 52,000 times faster than the speed of light, which probably contradicts a number given in some previous episode in some previous
Absolutely.
series. But Strange New Worlds is the latest series, so that is the current state of the.
Yeah. And really the speed of the message, like if they can have 2-way communication, and really it would depend on how far away, like it's never going to be consistent, because they're going
Right.
to call a colony somewhere and the distance is going to be greater than they traveled in a different episode. You know what I mean? Like there's no way, because it's all dependent on what the plot needs. If the plot needs Captain Kirk to be out of range, then he's out of range. And if it needs him to be close enough to call base, he's close enough to call base. Lately it seems like the mission of the Strange New Worlds Enterprise, at least, isn't to go out the way Kirk's Enterprise was, because they're hanging around Starbase 1, like almost like they're going out for an adventure and then coming back to base every few episodes, because they seem to be hanging around that Starbase and Earth's solar system a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually true.
Yeah. Off topic, but that seemed to be the case with Next Generation also. Like they
Yeah.
were constantly being recalled to Earth for whatever reason. And the whole point of the Galaxy ship is that you can do 25-year missions with families on board, and it's a generational ship because it's going to go so far away that you can't displace families from each other for, generations.
Right.
But they
Not-
were always back at Earth, like always.
Yeah.
Not only were they always back at Earth, but they were doing things like ferrying diplomats from one planet to another, which you wouldn't think you'd call on an exploration ship to do.
Right.
Yeah, it's
Right.
really like primarily the pilot where he talks about the great unexplored region of the galaxy.
Yeah.
And then like you said, they very quickly fall into sort of routine tasks in the Federation. But I mean that at least is an explanation for why they're able to call back to Earth so readily.
Yes.
But it's still, I mean, even more so, I would guess, or I would think in like Discovery, where they're out of range. It seems like sometimes, but they can call when they need to, pretty far distances with their hollow communications.
Yeah. And you would think that would be more difficult than just the, quote unquote radio signal,
Right.
because it's a hell of a lot more information that's being transferred.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
Which brings me to another thing that I wanted to discuss, which is along the same lines. See, we've already exhausted the basic topic, which I take again as an indictment of Charles's judgment in inviting me on to discuss this topic. But the transporter is some sort of beam. It's never stated that it's a subspace radio beam or is part of that spectrum or whatever. But I think I had always assumed that a transporter beam was basically like an informational, like an electromagnetic signal that was just carrying the information of a person's data pattern, a person's physical makeup converted into energy. But if that were the case, then you could use subspace radio to beam people from ship to ship, and they don't seem to have ever done that.
Well, they did add subspace as part of transport technology in TNG in the episode Realm of Fear. It's the one where Barclay was freaking out because that's, oh gosh, I just sighed. That's not one of those episodes. I don't really get it. But in that episode, Geordi was babbling about Barclay beaming through subspace. And that was the first time I'd ever heard about subspace being attached to the transporter. And to the point you're making, I think somebody just thought, hey, this sounds cool, because again, people who spend a lot of time talking about it, like, well, I don't understand, if this is an electromagnetic wave, how do you beam people's atoms through like a building or something? So then they added subspace to it, but it does kind of sort of make sense that you would use something like that. Voyager, the Herosian, that group, those giant reptilian hunter species who I just love, they had a type of a high-speed subspace conduit system that it's kind of like the Goa'uld in Stargate. Turns out they didn't create it, they found it. And there was a whole episode where I think they beamed the Doctor.
You're talking about the network, the relay network.
Yeah, the relay network. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the faster than light network.
The galactic internet.
Right.
Yeah. Because remember, they were using it, and a Herosian ship basically said, hey, quit using our network. And the first time they found that guy, Seven sent like a shock and blasted him. And I think they sent the Doctor to the Federation at one point. And I think they used the Herosian network once.
Mm-hmm. They used it. They used it once to send the Doctor to the Alpha Quadrant, because they discovered, when they discovered the network, they discovered that the furthest reaches of the network were just inside the Alpha Quadrant, and there was a ship nearby, and that they beamed the Doctor over because his pattern was bigger and therefore would be easier to send, which doesn't make any sense.
That doesn't make any sense.
No, the science there doesn't make sense at all. Right. In the universe.
And and they weren't supposed to be using the Herosian's network, but in fairness, the Herosian shouldn't have made their password Herosian1.
I thought you were going to say, in fairness to Voyager, which is another phrase that you have never uttered in your life.
Truth.
Did you guys want to catch some comments before we go to commercial?
Yeah, most of these are from the very top of the episode, where Mark chimes in and says, engage, and Wayne tells us, hello, everyone.
What's up, guys?
And then Mark chides me and says, you can't just put subspace in front of everything. But
Rhapsody.
Mark now says didn't Captain Ransom use subspace creatures? Yes, I was going to get to this to power the Equinox when they were trapped in the Delta Quadrant. Yes.
Yeah, and that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've encountered a number of things that live in the subspace realm, and I think that's super fascinating.
Mhm.
And I think that we need a spinoff called Star Trek Subspace.
All right, we'll take a quick. Let's take a quick break for a quick commercial or two, and then when we come back, we'll delve more into subspace. So stay right there. Look up, look down, look out. Here come the monkeys.
Mickey,
David,
Mike,
Peter.
We're talking about them in Monkeying Around. That's right, Monkeying Around has everything, including
interviews,
Episode reviews.
album discussions,
and other incredible surprises.
Monkeying Around, a podcast about the monkeys.
And we're back talking about Subspace Radio with Vandy Beth Glenn. Yeah, so one of the the first things I thought of when you were talking about Subspace, I mean, we have the Subspace Radio, which we communicate with, but then there was the Vaudoir in Voyager, which they didn't specifically say it was subspace, but they said they traveled through this realm called the underspace. We've heard several different references to sort of other. There's a mycelial network, of course, and like other realms, like other that aren't necessarily like alternate universes where there's another Captain Kirk in underspace, but but that you could travel like with physical objects through this underspace and arrive somewhere faster because presumably the distances don't matter so much.
Yeah.
You eliminate the higher dimensions. And the way I think about it is, if you think of, this is completely incorrect, if you think of our universe as a sphere, and it's not, but if you think of our universe as a sphere, and then you project like a shadow, like if you shine a light on it, and you can have a shadow that comes down to a focus on a piece of paper below it, then you can have a point that is the shadow of the universe, and that point is quote unquote smaller than the entire universe. That point would be subspace or underspace.
Yeah.
And if you could get into that point could theoretically touch the entire universe. It's kind of like how wormholes really work in wormhole theory. So like you said, Charles, right? Underspace, subspace. I think it's really cool. And one of the things that we were talking about, we were talking about the beings that live in it. That goes back to when Geordi in that one episode of TNG said there were different domains. And so the deep domains are where the Federation and Starfleet has only managed to send signals. The higher domains of where they maybe do transporters and where the Borg conduits, the Borg transwarp conduits go down there, subspace conduits. But then you're right, there's, according to them, I don't know how many domains, there's all these deeper levels of space, subspace. Who knows what's down there? There could be creatures and all kinds of crazy stuff down there.
There are.
Yeah, they're using CGI ones.
Exactly.
But yeah, the way you described that just now with all the universe being at one point, that made me think of Threshold when they hit infinite velocity and you exist everywhere in the universe simultaneously and turn into a lizard.
I'm so sorry that you thought of that.
I love that episode. It's okay.
Yes, it is good.
Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of the same thing. So I mean, you'd think that hitting warp 10 would be essentially like achieving subspace, you know what I mean? But without like a portal to travel through. But whereas, I mean, even with the underspace, like the Vaudoir would go through and there's a tunnel. And the same kind of thing with a wormhole, you're traveling through a tunnel. With transwarp conduits, you're traveling through. There's always these tunnels they're traveling through.
Right.
But then it seemed like Tom Paris, when he, like the idea is that they would just exist everywhere all at once and you could just be wherever you are, I would guess, based on the way they described it in that episode.
See, that's the thing that gets me. I mean, I can envision, a subspace, whatever, but the whole existing at every point all at once.
Well, see, there's a shadow. Do the shadow thing. I'm just kidding.
Right. It makes as much sense as the Mushroom Network. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the
but-
mushroom network made more sense.
okay.
Oh boy. Oh boy. Yeah.
I wouldn't argue against that.
Yeah. There's a
Yeah.
topic for another show. Which of the science makes more sense or not? It's also kind of interesting because if you look at the concept of subspace, sub meaning below, the other term in science fiction you hear all the time is hyperspace, which is on the exact opposite side of the coin. Hyperspace is typically thought of as 4-dimensional or even 5-dimensional space. And the point of hyperspace is the speed of light is just not a barrier. In our universe, the speed of light's a barrier. It's just end of story. The universe will not let anything travel faster than light. But in hyperspace, you apply, like in our real universe, if you apply more power to a physical body, its mass gets infinite, and therefore a physical ship can never approach the speed of light. But in hyperspace, the rules of physics are just different. More power, you just go faster. And then hyperspace is also weird because Star Wars had to do this too. Hyperspace is also sometimes thought of as like it's like a higher level where, again, it's like you go into a room and connects different points of the universe. So hyperspace can be thought of as like a shortcut and also a place where physics is faster. And then I sometimes think they created subspace just because it sounded cooler than, it was a different thing, subspace.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you describe that, though, is with the higher dimensions. That's something that they don't talk about that terms a lot on Star Trek. You get like these terms like underspace or hyperspace or whatever, but they don't really talk about fourth dimensional or fifth dimensional space in that way. Where like, I mean, if you think about Flatland, where there was, like a two-dimensional environment, and if you're transposed into a three-dimensional environment, you know what I mean? Like that sort of concept of like changing your perception like that isn't something they really go into a lot on Star Trek, but I think that kind of stuff is interesting to think about. If you had fourth dimensional or fifth dimensional travel, like what would that mean, and how would like a three-dimensional human perceive that?
Right.
I don't know why they go more for the flashy terms, like the cool terms on Star Trek, rather than talking about like we're going to travel through fifth dimensional space. So we're going through the super space or whatever.
Yeah.
All right. Mark has a good point here. He says in the old Gold Key comics in the 1960s, the crew encountered beings that traveled in super space.
Interesting. That must have been hyperspace, super space. I like that term. That sounds like a 1960s term.
And while we're at it, Wayne says, now subspace is beginning to sound like Improbability Drive from Hitchhikers. Yes.
I was thinking we've gone plaid.
The Improbability Drive. I love that.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
We something we see a lot on Star Trek, and it was sort of especially the later years of Voyager, it became like an annoying trope. But it was what people call the yet another subspace anomaly, or YASA is how we used to type it on the internet when we were complaining about it. But there was a lot of subspace anomalies where there's anomalies where like our space and subspace are colliding, and I mean whatever, it's causing strange things to happen. Eventually, you have to use the main deflector to fire a chronoton particle at it, and that will at the end of every episode. But I mean, it's interesting that there's whatever the barrier is between our reality and whatever subspace is. I mean, it seems to be not difficult to puncture. Like it happens accidentally all the time, and it can happen deliberately all the time.
It could fold on itself.
True.
What did you say, Veronica?
Fold.
It could fold on itself.
Oh.
Yes. Which is a concept that numerous sci-fi properties have invested in. Up to Dune and the Navigators.
To follow up on that, Charles, and extend a little bit past the Subspace Radio, that I forget the name of it. You remember that kind of spooky TNG episode where Riker and them kept getting abducted and turns out they're being experimented on? I think those creatures were in yet another domain of subspace.
Right.
And because remember remember one dude came back and his lungs had been changed where he couldn't breathe air anymore, and they think these beings lived in some weird subspace domain, and I think they cut Worf's hand off and put it back on and all this kind of. But
that happened to Tom Paris. Tom Paris couldn't breathe air anymore.
Oh, there you are. He found a way to connect it back. But yeah, they were living in another one of those ranges, domains of subspace that they talked about.
Right. Yeah, and I mean I don't know what causes like. I don't know how like they find these subspace anomalies like just in space, right? But they don't really go into like how did this happen? Like, was there an
Right.
accident? Like, sometimes you'll see it happen on the show as part of the plot, but sometimes they just fly up and there's a subspace anomaly there,
Right.
and it's
Mhm.
causing
Yeah.
strange things to happen in our universe. But the way you're talking about like traveling from here to there, it makes me think of A Wrinkle in Time with the description
Yes.
of the Tesseract. And I
Yes.
think they even had a drawing in the book. I read that when I was a kid, where
Me
it was like
too.
you have a string and the ant walks across the string, but if you touch the
Yes.
string together, they can go right across, which is
Mhm.
kind of like traveling through subspace,
Mhm.
Yeah, that's warping space.
Mhm.
And it's funny because that warping space, like you said, where you take two ends of a string or two ends of the sheet and put them together, that's kind of warping space to reverse what our universe does by expanding. But Star Trek added subspace to the warp drive. So they actually, I've read this for decades. I still don't kind of understand. They kind of warp space, which makes you think like initially they're just doing the string thing, but then they babble about a subspace bubble. Somebody explain, somehow they go into subspace and travel faster than light. It's not quite like, so subspace is like that catch-all for a lot of stuff.
Well, part of it is because they don't know how to travel faster than light.
Right.
Like if they knew how to
Yeah.
do that, they wouldn't be making TV shows. They on spaceships,
Right.
But I mean, one thing I've always liked about Star Trek is that they at least attempt to make it feel
Yes.
like consistent. Although it's not
Absolutely.
consistent. There's been whole books
Mhm.
about how inconsistent it is. But
Absolutely.
it feels like they really make an effort to make the terms feel like they're grounded in reality,
Mhm.
and they're not
Right.
just saying spacey things.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
They try to have in-universe consistency. One of the things I was thinking about when that topic came up was one of the things that's so important about it is you so often hear about, even in real life, far-flung empires and how when they colonize and they create colonies and so forth, they basically fall away from the motherland or from the controlling country. And one of the reasons this happens, of course, is you're so far away from each other, you literally just lose contact, or you can develop differently. I've read science fiction stories, for example, where you'll have Earth puts a colony on the planet, and then they lose contact for decades, and then when they reestablish contact, they're truly alien to each other. And I think one of the things subspace might help do, it wouldn't completely, but if you have a colony where, say, it would take 20 years by ship to get there, even at fast ship speed, but you could still communicate with subspace, that allows you to have some contact with Earth and can kind of keep the culture going. Doesn't mean you're not going to change. You're still going to change.
You're going to change.
Yeah, but it might help a little bit, kind of keep an attachment that you wouldn't know. There's an episode of Enterprise, Charles' favorite show, called Terra Nova, I think. It's in the very
Oh my
first
gosh.
season.
That's bad for an Enterprise episode.
It is a bad. Okay, Charles. What was it? There was the term shale they kept using or something like that. But the whole point of the episode was that colony, which was not far at all.
No.
By the Enterprise's terms, they had simply lost contact with Earth. I think they had an asteroid storm, and simply the being apart from Earth for a few decades, they had developed into a slightly different culture. And had they had, even if a ship hadn't gotten there, had they still had subspace radio communications, it could have helped. They still would have been different, but it could have helped the culture kind of stay in touch.
Right.
Yeah, it could have helped, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it would have.
Yeah.
Right.
Because you still have that phenomenon like you get in corporate America or retail, where it's like you're in a store and the home office is in New York, and they're like, oh, if those people ever worked in a real store, they would know how these things work and how they're, so you're always going to have that situation where no matter how close or how remote you are, even if you're in constant contact with the home office, you're still going to make your own decisions because those people don't understand the conditions in which you live.
Well, we can think here in the present day / near future when we have a colony on Mars. Mars is going to be with current rocket technology several months journey from Earth. But by radio, it's only a few minutes. I mean, maybe around 20 or 30 minutes, I think, at the most. And just having that separation, just the simple fact that there's no real-time communication between Earth and Mars is going to mean that Mars is going to develop a separate culture from Earth very quickly.
Yeah.
Right.
And what's interesting about that, because you don't think about it in galactic terms, but when you're talking about our closest neighbor in the solar system, communication is going to be, because planets have different rate of movement, have different rotations. They travel around the sun at different paces. And the farther the two planets are apart from each other, the longer it'll take when they're in closer orbit with each other. It's going to be much quicker. And that makes a big difference when you're just talking about your solar system neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting way to look at it. And of course, the universe is always in movement. It's just at a much different rate.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of think of things as more stationary than what they actually are.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Go to Mark's comment real quick because it gave me a theory.
Yeah, I was just about to get to that one. Maybe the Delta Quadrant was, I guess he's saying, a weak point between real space, warp space, and subspace.
Mm-hmm.
So it's saying it has fault lines or something, as it were.
Well, that made me think, because one thing we know about the Delta Quadrant is that that's where the Borg is. The Borg are. I guess Borg is might be correct, but the Borg use
Where
transwarp
the Borg be.
Yeah, that's where the Borg at. But they have this vast network of transwarp conduits, and I wonder if utilizing the transwarp conduits in that way might be what causes all these weird subspace anomalies and fissures and folds and things to be going on specifically in the Delta Quadrant. They exist everywhere else. The Delta Quadrant seems to have, I mean, you can't fly 2 weeks without hitting a subspace anomaly. You know what I mean? But I mean, I wonder. We've seen on the other shows that those transwarp conduits, when not maintained, are pretty dangerous. Right, when they go through one, it's way scarier on the modern shows than when the Borg were using them. So I wonder if, like, for one, the Borg are maintaining their stability with whatever energies they're using, but also, I mean, if they're just causing damage to subspace. But then that made me think too that there was that episode where they were talking about warp drive is causing damage to subspace by using higher warp, and she ignites, does whatever to her pod to cause a subspace rupture. Subspace ruptures seem to happen like you're ripping subspace, or you know what I mean, or I don't know if you're ripping space, ripping subspace, and letting space out. I don't know. I don't know which side's going which way. But but it seems like warp and transwarp both could potentially have that effect on space and allowing subspace anomalies to occur.
That seems
that's true. I
Given that all of this is fiction, that seems very logical and scientific.
Well, it goes back to I think what Charles said earlier is true, because the whole point about the reason I do love Star Trek is because even when the stuff is pretty much impossible, they try to maintain fairly consistent in-universe science,
right?
Especially for a show that's been around for like 60 years. I mean, I got to give them credit,
Yeah.
So even I don't freak out too much, like you said, Charles, in Enterprise, they got to cling on to Kronos like the next day. Like, oh, that don't make any sense, but they had to get the plot going. So
things were a lot closer together back then. The universe is always expanding.
Maybe they moved Kronos to get further from Earth since then.
There you go. They relocated
humans.
Absolutely.
But then they accidentally parked it next to the Romulans, and it's like, oh crap.
But you were talking about the whole thing with Captain Horatio Hornblower and stuff, and I remember reading in the novelization of The Search for Spock.
Okay.
And they talked about how before Kirk, a lot of starship captains were basically getting killed. There were a lot of ships were getting lost, and so I think and this is in universe, and so the people that even Captain Pike represented were seen as almost a little too nice, too cerebral. And Kirk was actually a class of people who was actually chosen to be a little bit more that adventurer, a little bit more rule breaking. Right. And one of the things that goes along with that, back to what you're saying, Charles, is also when Kirk was around, it still took weeks, sometimes even months for a signal to get back. So they wanted people who are kind of more rough and tumble. And then by the time you get to people like Picard, who is a great guy, then the communications is a lot faster. So there wasn't as much time. Like there was almost no time you really saw, like you said, with TNG, where, I mean, Picard was often out there with a phenomenon or a creature, but there's not a lot of times where Picard had to make decisions where he say, oh man, this could be horrible. I'll hear what Starfleet says later. I mean, they first encountered the Borg. He sent a message saying we've engaged the Borg the second time. But one of the reasons they chose Kirk, they said that entire class of people under Kirk was different. because they knew they were going to be out there, they were going to be on their own, and they needed a special type of person at that time.
Yeah, I think that could spin off into a whole different subject.
Yeah.
Yeah. The motion picture novelization asserts that like the people we see in Starfleet are like the throwback people. Like the people on Earth are way more advanced.
Yes.
But the people we see in Star Trek are sort of like the ones they're sending out into space, you know, which is different from like in the original Star Trek Bible that appears in the Making of Star Trek by Stephen Greenfield. It says like the year could be 1999 or 2999. But close enough that humanity is still humanity, because the idea behind the show is that people are still the way they are. So it's interesting that just in like less than a decade or a little over a decade later, Roddenberry is now saying that, well, no, back on Earth, they're way more advanced than these like modern day-ish humans that are on the Enterprise.
Right. Right.
It's off topic. I just got on a tangent.
Yeah. No. One of the things I always thought was funny Star Trek used to do back in the early days, and science fiction was often guilty of this, is when they would come up with a new futuristic technology, they would kind of pretend like the old technology no longer existed or they didn't use it much. I remember in the, I think it was the episode Bread and Circuses. I think that was the episode, but I remember Uhura was talking about this signal. She goes, I'm getting the signal in what I think they used to call radio. Like, okay, you know what radio is, even if you don't use it anymore.
Because they use subspace radio on the show.
Radio.
That's
It's called radio. Not like subspace radio, which is totally, I know all about. It's my job.
I mean, at the very least, the appliances in her house would be using radio to talk to each other.
You would think, or maybe they use subspace radio. I don't know.
You would need a subspace signal to change the channel on your TV.
But I wonder if you did use a subspace radio to change the channel on your TV, if you're so close, would the signal arrive before you sent it? And so the channel be changing before you hit the button.
Wow.
And like it would change and like, oh, Star Trek's on. I better push the button so that it will have gone there. So I won't have missed it.
You just blew my mind. Something else I wanted to bring up is it's never said how expensive or how rare subspace technology is. So like the Enterprise, did it just have the one transmitter and receiver, or were there receivers all over the ship? Because it occurred to me just while we were having this conversation, if there's subspace radio, then there could be subspace radio and TV stations. And you know, if they have that, if it's that easy to stay connected, then there would be what we have today. There would be radio stations, you know, playing all the greatest hits of 2369. There would be, you know, there would be TV shows. There would be sitcoms, My Favorite Martian, or, you know, whatever. And we don't see any evidence of that in any of the series.
We see some. I mean, the Ferengi had on Lower Decks. They had the whole Ferengi TV shows, and I think we've seen them intercepting a TV show. Like I there was an episode where like Neelix was watching alien soap operas or something. Unless I had a really weird dream one time. I don't remember the details though, but you would think that'd be the fun part of being a communications officer, would be like listening in as you approach a planet of like decades potentially. And we know in the real world, our radio signals actually break down. They don't actually go to other planets,
right?
But they become too weak. But subspace radio, I mean, might those just go on? You know, might you be able to, as you're approaching a planet, you're 100 light years out and you're picking up, you know, I Love Lucy. And then when you're 70 light years out, you're picking up Star Trek. And then when you're, you know, my math's falling apart here, but eventually you're watching Game of Thrones. You know what I mean? Like you're getting it all as you're approaching the planet.
But what we're talking, this is something that I thought about the other day, and I completely failed to remember to bring it up here, was that you're producing content specifically for a subspace radio or television network that can be beamed out to all of the ships that are traveling. And that's another way of keeping contact with the home base, where you're getting an update on whatever is current on the top 40 charts or whatever the newest sitcom is or whatever. You're still getting that like you're still at home. I mean, there would be a delay in receiving it, but everybody else on the ship is getting it at the same time. So your immediate community, nobody will spoil you on anything because they're getting it too. But that's something that I thought would be really an interesting concept. You know, we talked about this a little bit before, where we have seen those ever so few examples of other cultures and their forms of entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to know what, first of all, what all that entails, but also like a Klingon soap opera or whatever. But at the same time, I would really be interested in knowing more about, in the Federation, in Starfleet, who produces content to basically, you know, entertain the troops, to keep the troops connected, to make them feel like home isn't so far away.
Like
Yeah,
services, radio, things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it seems like in the Star Trek universe, the entertainment's all on demand. Like they have holo programs and you play it and they're interactive. You know what I mean? But there's never at least very rarely there's live broadcasts that they're watching or prepackaged or curated programs that they're watching. Usually it's kind of like our society has actually gone to, where mostly you've got on demand content all the time. And it's even more like some of the AI content that they're talking about is coming, because usually, I mean, you could, you know, instead of just watching a concert from 1960s, you could say, I want to watch, you know, Elvis and Mick Jagger do a duet together at Shea Stadium, and the holodeck can do that, where that's the kind of stuff that they're playing around with AI, where it seems like that's really where the Star Trek universe went as far as entertainment goes.
Wayne, it's funny. Wayne and I were just talking about this a couple of days ago. We were texting about this, and one of the things we were talking about was Star Trek almost always stayed away from what they consider whatever their contemporary entertainment is. I think because they don't want to date themselves. Like I can think right now. Remember a horrible episode of Lost in Space where they went to a planet and they were basically doing disco. Well, they were doing the dancing, the beatnik dancing. And you can think Buck Rogers had a horrible episode. Buck Rogers 25th Century had a horrible episode where they basically had P-Funk, Parliament Funkadelic. And it dates it because if you notice, almost everything in Star Trek entertainment, to your point, Charles, it's like it's old stuff and it's like Shakespeare and it's classical
because
music.
it's public domain.
Yeah, that too, right? So you never see. So and then in the an episode I personally can't stand. It's the TNG episode where they first encountered the Romulans. I don't like that episode.
Oh, that's a good episode.
I know most people like that episode.
I like it.
But when the country guy was saying,
LQ Sonny Clemens,
that's the guy. He goes, whenever he said turn on the television, Data pretty much said television had basically gone away, that nobody watched television anymore. So there was like no entertainment stations or anything like that.
Right.
One thing that when you guys saying it, you got me really think about Subspace. When I was growing up, we've talked about this. When I was growing up, I used to listen to AM radio all the time, and people who know AM radio know that at night you can get much farther signals. And growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, I used to listen to WLS. I used to listen to a station from Memphis, and I used to listen to a station from Chicago, and I even heard Reverend Ike all the way from New York City back in Texas at night on AM radio. I also was a bit of a ham radio and shortwave radio enthusiast. And so one of the things I think about, you know, to this day, we talk about if we had like a nuclear war or our civilization fell, there are still people, men and women, who do ham radio and shortwave radio so that they can communicate when all the rest of civilization falls. And I wonder if, in addition to entertainment, you know, I could see Subspace being used for that. Which makes me wonder about what happened with Discovery. Now, I forget what happened when Warp Drive fell. Did they have Subspace to stay in touch?
Supposedly
they had to have.
Well, I mean, the Federation hadn't fallen in Discovery. The Federation was weakened because their travel was broken down. But I mean, they were still in communication with the Emerald Chain, they did, etc. So I don't think that like a loss of subspace radio was necessarily the problem. But you're talking about the distances, because like my grandfather used to in North Georgia when my mom was a kid used to go up on the roof and turn the antenna to South Carolina so he could get his wrestling on Saturday nights. He would always tell me that story. But it seems like on Star Trek, like if you have enough power, I don't know if there is a range like problem with subspace. Because remember that conspiracy, for instance, they were broadcasting like they didn't say where, but it seemed like it was like the other side of the galaxy or something, you know?
Right.
But so it seemed like if you had the power behind it, you could send a subspace signal for a long way. Maybe that's why they don't broadcast a lot of live entertainment, because they don't. Eventually, it's going to get to like other quadrants of the galaxy, and the Borg are going to be watching it. You know.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe that's a good point. Okay, I got to get 4 comments.
Okay.
First of all, Bill Lamond has joined and said, "Nice, our discussion is more timey-wimey fun than Doctor Who."
Okay.
Wayne says that what we're talking about sounds like the Forced Entertainment Network overseas.
Forced Entertainment
Mark
Network.
says that the Doctor's holo novel Chains of Light was a big hit.
It's true.
And Bill also says that he remembers hearing of Reverend Ike, but can't recall if he actually ever heard him.
Oh boy, if you'd heard him, you'd know. Trust me, that was not one. He was in. You know, it's funny. Also, you guys talking about Subspace. I remembered something very interesting. The Cage / the Menagerie. They obviously didn't have subspace radio. At least the people who crashed on Talos didn't. Because remember what happened was as they were getting near Talos, they were hitting the radio signals, not the subspace radio. And one of the reasons it taken so long is because it had taken the radio signals, which could only travel at the speed of light, so long to get to wherever point in space the Enterprise was. And they were literally passing through the radio waves. And if they'd had subspace, they probably would tell Earth, hey, we crashed on Talos 4. But that's why it took, 20 years or something like that before anybody even found them. And there's a difference between subspace and regular radio. If you crash and you don't have subspace radio, you could be kind of messed up if nobody knows where you are.
So is like the development of subspace what Jose Tyler was talking about when he said we've broken the time barrier, talking about the new ships, you know, that might be whatever the verbiage they're using at that time. Because he did say when they went to warp, he was like our time warp factor 6 or whatever, because they hadn't nailed down the verbiage yet for Star Trek. But it's interesting to think about just I mean, it's all been kind of retconned out now because of Strange New Worlds and Discovery, but it's interesting to think about anyway. And I hate to cut it off, but we're kind of running out of time here.
Yeah, we are.
Wow.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because Bill is wondering how he can access fan content that's part of Dragon Con. We might have to answer that separately. That's
wrestling. Bill.
Dragon Con TV.
Yeah, Dragon Con TV, I think you can still subscribe to after the fact.
And
yes, you can. You
Yeah.
can.
And I don't know if they've gotten the 2024 content on there, but they have past years, a lot of the main panels on there.
And
So
a
way to get that.
ton of it.
Totally worth it.
Yeah.
$10 to it.
What's the last thing I'll say? The reason I love concepts like this is because you look at what would happen in science fiction, and then you have to contrast that with what we'll probably know will happen in real life, which is when we finally do get to space, we probably will be days, hours, weeks, months, and years out of touch with each other. And that would change everything.
Yes, but as we've seen in the past, things that were thought up on Star Trek have been developed into real life things.
Yeah.
To solve the problems that we encounter when we're doing these far-reaching kind of things. So by the time we get to actually exploring space and actually colonizing other planets, we will have thought of something similar to subspace radio. We will keep in contact somehow.
I hope so. I really do.
We all just need to find one of those cryonics companies from the neutral zone. They can put us in the capsule too, and then Data can wake us up and tell us what happened.
And shoot us into space for some reason I still don't understand. Yeah.
Right. Well, Vandy Beth, thank you for joining us and for suggesting this topic, because I thought it was a really fun one.
Well, thank you for having me, and this was fun.
Yeah.
Maybe next time we can talk about transporters.
Oh,
Maybe.
dude, we could do 5 shows on transporters.
Yeah.
Don't threaten me with a good time.
Well, Vandy Beth, where can people find more of you?
Well, my own podcast, Jettison Pod, is currently still on hiatus, but I am, in addition to a stand-up, and I perform around town. I am a librarian at the Alpharetta Library, a job that I got with the kind assistance of Alan over there, and I host at the library. I host a monthly open mic, which is Tuesday evenings from 6 to 7:30. It's the second Tuesday of each month, and our next one is this coming Tuesday, the 8th of October. So
I didn't know you were doing that. I know your Scrabble club, but I didn't know about your open mic. That's really cool.
I'll get to the Scrabble club in a moment, but
well, pardon me for jumping ahead.
But yeah, the open mic is any kind of performers. We've had a beatboxer before. We have poets. One of my coworkers played the piano last month. Puppets are welcome, Charles and Veronica.
Okay.
If you want to make the trek up to Alpharetta. And I've been doing some storytelling in addition to my stand-up. So really, it's a complete free-for-all. The Alpharetta Library has a beautiful 150-seat auditorium.
Wow.
And we have a stage. It's a wonderful resource, and I would love to see the open mic continue to grow. So everybody listening and everybody on this call with me, please consider coming down on the second Tuesday of each month. And tomorrow at the library from 4 to 5:30 is the first meeting of the Alpharetta Library Scrabble Club. We have 5 boards and 2 players' dictionaries, and no shortage of nerds. So if you want to bring your vocabulary and get your spell on, that would be great.
Awesome.
Nice.
Mhm.
All right, Alan, where do people find more of you?
CosmicCreative.com. KOZMIC creative.com. Got new announcements coming out. I keep saying very soon, and it's going to happen, I promise. But I just haven't got to the place yet where I'm ready to pull the trigger, but it's going to get pulled soon.
Okay. How about you, Keith?
You can find me on X and also Facebook, primarily the ESO Network Facebook groups.
And how about us, Veronica?
Feltnerdy.com.
That's right. That's where you find our family-friendly, all-ages content. You can also look up Felt Nerdy and Dirty, which is our adult content where we do burlesque shows and things like that, but with puppets, which makes everything better. And if
That's
you're in
what
the
you should do at the library.
And if you're in the Atlanta area, we've got a show coming up on October 13th, which is going to be a lot of fun, called the Dirty Weirdo Show. It's adult-only show, 3 p.m. We're teaming up with our friend Showtime Theater, who he's doing like gory puppets, and we're doing like sexy puppets. It's all going to be fun. It's going to be a good time. So tickets are available for that now on Eventbrite, or you can find it through our Facebook page at Felt Nerdy and Dirty, or check out our Instagram, Felt Nerdy and Dirty. We also have a YouTube, same thing, Felt Nerdy and Dirty. So check it out. And Veronica, where else can people find us?
Monkeying Around, a podcast about the monkeys.
That's right. And we just aired an interview with Andrew Sandoval, who's one of the great monkeys historians basically there's ever been. He's the monkeys archivist. He's gone through the Mickey Dolenz archive. He's has his own imprint called Beatland Books, where he releases books about the monkeys, and they're the nicest books we've ever owned in our lives. And then we've got an episode coming up. Our next episode will be with Micah Khan, who was the director of a film called The Zombie Wedding, which co-starred Mickey Dolenz in a key role. So that's going to be a lot of fun. We had a good talk with him, and we had a good time. And do you have a closing for us this week?
I do.
Okay.
I keep us connected.
Because that's from Subspace. You're absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Before we go, we should say that next week we are going to be talking about the new fan film, Farragut Forward.
That's right. And I've been a Farragut fan since they started in 2007 when they were doing TOS era. And
yeah,
they've gone far enough now that they're bringing the show back with the movie era. And it's the most, if not the most ambitious Star Trek fan film ever, the most ambitious Star Trek fan film in years, because it looks phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Looking forward to talking about that. All right.
So between now and then, go watch Farragut Forward on YouTube.
Yes. And we might have a cast member or someone with us. So make sure you watch the episode and then make sure you have your questions ready for whoever our guest ends up being.
That's right.
So everybody be here next Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. See you then.
Bye, everybody.
Hailing frequencies closed.